Welcome to the Paul Street Journal, a production of St. Paul Inside the Walls. The Paul Street Journal is a show all about Catholic economics. From discussing the economic principles laid out in Scripture to answering the economic questions that come up in our daily lives, this show will be your guide to making your own economic decisions with the heart of the Church. I'm Freddy Garcia, and I'm joined by my co-host, Brian Honsberger. Welcome to the third episode of Season 2 of the Paul Street Journal. This episode is a little different because we're doing a radio address, which has been transcribed. The encyclical that we were going to do, or the one that we're going to do next, mentions this radio address and some of the ideas mentioned in this radio address, so we thought it'd be worth covering it here. But also in a way that we're noting that it is just a radio address. It's the head of the church talking to the people of the world, the people of God. So it's a little different in its nature to the encyclicals that we've been doing and that we're going to do, but we think it's worth covering. So it's by Pope Pius XII, and it comes out in 1941, June 1st of that year. So it's not on the date of, it's not May 15th.
It's only 2 weeks later.
Right.
And he released this on the Feast of Pentecost.
Yeah, he releases it on Pentecost in 1941, and he, talks about that in the radio address. And because it's a radio address, there's not like a specific title, but the transcription calls it the social structure and the individual right cannot in any way be suppressed. And I think those are just two things he says in the radio address. But that's what it is, 50 years, more or less, after Rerum Novarum. So before we jump into the actual radio address itself, like we've done in the past two episodes, we'll give an overview of who Pope Pius XII is, when he's writing, what qualifies him to make any of these claims, even though it's just a radio address. But Brian, who is Pope Pius XII?
Well, like Leo XIII and Pius XI, an extraordinarily interesting individual. And it's tempting to talk too much about Pope Pius XII because there's so much to say, but we're going to say what's required for this episode and then get into the radio broadcast.
Okay.
So historians have written so much about any character associated with World War II, whether that's FDR or Churchill or Pope Pius XII, because this was such an intense moment in the world. Pope Pius XII, when Pius XI died, rumor has it that there was debate among the College of Cardinals, like who should be the next pope? Should it be a spiritual person? Should it be a theologian? Should it be a diplomat? And guess who they chose? The diplomat. So Pope Pius XII, before he was pope, he was acquaintances with Winston Churchill, with Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was in charge of Germany during World War I, had all sorts of connections to Bavaria, Prussia, even Soviet Russia. So because of his diplomatic connections and experience, he was chosen to be pope. And legend has it that he was unsure of himself, maybe. So when he was elected, he had the whole college vote again.
Oh, wow.
To make sure that that's what they wanted.
And it worked.
Yeah, and he chose the name Pius XII to honor his predecessor, Pope Pius XI, and honors him not just in name, but in this radio address, celebrating the 10-year anniversary, not just of Quadragesimo Anno, which we talked about last episode, and of course the 50th anniversary of Rerum Novarum.
Right.
So we have this diplomat. He wrote about 41 encyclicals, which is half of what Leo XIII wrote. But remember, we're talking about a diplomat. So he did a lot of traveling. He went to the United States and provided over 1,000 speeches and radio addresses, things like that. So less of a writer, more of a talker and a relationship builder, perhaps. He did do some things that were theological. So he is responsible for that ex cathedra announcement and apostolic constitution that made the Assumption of Mary a dogma. He made some interesting organizational moves within the Catholic Church. So before this pope, the majority of the College of Cardinals were Italian. And what we see this Pope doing, Pius XII, he's bringing people into the college from other parts of the country, other parts of Europe, Asia, the Middle East, even the United States, India, right? So he's diversifying the College of Cardinals and making the church as a whole led by a more diverse group of people with diverse backgrounds.
Nice.
His most famous encyclical that I'm aware of is Humani Generis, which,
Heard of it.
yeah, it talks about the role of evolutionary science in the Catholics' understanding of the origins of humanity. So he seems to be very interested in allowing science to have a little more space within the faith, and he never wants science and theology to be in conflict with one another. So he leaves a lot of doors open there. And one thing that he demands is the belief of Catholics that every soul is generated and given to a human being. So he leaves openness in regards to the origins of the flesh in a human being.
Nice.
Which is pretty interesting.
So, considering the popes we've already mentioned, Pope Leo, Pope Pius XI, they were writing at a time where there's this industrial boom, technological boom, and then, that just keeps advancing. So now we're at a pope who does this radio address. I'm sure questions about science are more present than they were maybe when Pope Leo XIII was pope. So it sounds kind of like what you mentioned in one of the previous episodes about theology having to interact with other spheres. It sounds very necessary for Pius. And I'm curious, because I also know a little about Pius XII, but you say he's a diplomat. And it sounds like it was necessary almost for him to be a diplomat. So, and he made theological advancements too. So, still sounds like this really qualified pope, necessary for the time in which he's in. But yeah, I'm curious, and he does, I think, address some of those questions about, those technological advances, where the world has gone. But I think it's part of the landscape he's in. It sounds a little maybe more complex than the previous popes, even though they had their complexities and difficulties, as we know. Just a thought.
Yeah, I like that thought. I liked what you had to observe about the interdisciplinary nature of this pope, and it wasn't just him, but it was also something that he prioritized among all of the leadership of the church. So he changed seminary formation to include sociology, psychology. He required that there were psychological assessments done on a regular basis of priests to make sure that everybody was, before the term was used, mentally healthy.
Yeah.
Which was important at that time. There was a lot of messed up stuff going around.
Yeah.
And a lot of woundedness and damage during World War II. It's a very dark time.
Yeah. You might not know these dates off the top of your head, but do you know when he becomes pope, what year that is? Like if it's right before the war, during the war?
It's during the war. I don't know the date, but I think it might be 1939.
Okay.
Yeah, so the war is like rather fresh. And I think that the radio address that we're talking about, it's 1941. So that's in the heat of the war.
Yeah.
And nobody knows who's going to win at this time. And the official position of the Vatican under Pius XII is neutral. And a lot of people have criticized Pope Pius XII for being not vocal enough against the Axis powers. But later on, as documents became more and more available, what we've learned is that he took the approach of being diplomatically neutral, but did a lot in action against the Nazis and also against the Soviet Union.
Okay.
So there is no shortage of books to read about that, right? Okay. So we'll leave that for another time.
Okay. Hey, everyone. It's me. Sorry for interrupting the show. I'm sure I probably interrupted Brian talking, so it's okay. But I just want to jump in to say that if you're liking the Paul Street Journal and you want to see more content like it, please do like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications so that you're notified when we have any new releases. And also, if you have any questions or comments, please do leave them in the comment section and we'll try our very best to respond to them later on in the episodes. Also, make sure to check out the other shows that are produced by the diocese. Those shows are Beyond the Beacon with Bishop Kevin Sweeney, which you can find on Bishop Kevin Sweeney's YouTube channel, and Coffee with Cupkey with Father Paul Manning and Monsignor Raymond Cupkey, which you can find right here on the St. Paul Inside the Walls YouTube channel. with all that said, thank you. Let's get back to the show. Is it time to get into the address, you think?
Sure.
Okay, one of the things that we've done for the previous two documents is talk about the landscape, or the economic landscape. I mean, this one maybe is a bit clearer than the others because you said they're in the heat of World War II. So that is kind of telling of what the economic landscape is like. But anything to add maybe about the landscape? He says a few things, which maybe we could...
Yeah, we'll highlight what he says, but the landscape is basically the economies, no matter what country you're in, has become a war economy. And then it's important to know that it's under the papacy of Pius XII that there's a spread of communism. So we get this thing called the Eastern Bloc. It's not just in Russia, but it's elsewhere. Ukraine, Poland, all the way into Eastern Europe, like the old Yugoslavian state and all the states that make up that place. That's where Russia's going.
Okay. Yeah, I think he calls that, or the landscape he comes into, like surprising. Or maybe not, I think he's like, the past 10 years since Quadragesimo Anno have been wrought full of terrible surprises, kind of. So I think what stands out is that it's in a very dark time for the world, especially where he is, you know? So apart from the landscape, I think he does then start saying why he makes his radio address. And again, praises Rerum Novarum, maybe less so than Pius XI did, but he did say that Rerum Novarum should be written in gold letters in the calendar. So more praise, and also praising Quadragesimo Anno by Pius XI, and he must be the first to say that this is the promulgating of Quadragesimo Anno kind of set up this tradition that that commemorating Rerum Novarum is now going to be a thing, essentially. So he writes this on the 50th anniversary, and then we know that later there are more. So I think Pius XII is the first maybe to say that, oh, this is, a thread to follow.
That's right. He's confirming the confirmation.
Yeah, he's confirming.
And he uses the term Magna Carta also with Rerum Novarum.
So let's jump into his content.
Yes, it's very brief.
Yeah,
It's hard to find online in English. You'll never be able to watch a video or listen to a recording. You'll have to read it. The people to whom the radio message is addressed is the children of the whole world. The audience isn't bishops and priests, right? Yeah. It's just everybody, which includes bishops and priests.
Right.
And also kind of interesting is that he praises the radio as he begins the radio message. So he talks about radio, how it could be used for good or for bad. This is kind of a reflection on technology. He says that radio is used as a weapon of war, but in this case, it's used for peace, a peaceful message sent out to the whole world. And he quotes the psalm that says, "Their sound has gone forth throughout all the earth." Beautiful.
Very beautiful. Yeah, I really like that bit. So, and like I said, he's now writing in this technological, the technological boom is still booming, and this is part of it. I guess for me, it's kind of crazy now that before we were talking about popes that, all they did was write with like a feather and some like really old paper, but now we're getting to this pope that has the radio, and it's like not that far of a time gap between the two. Or let's say Pope Leo and this one. Now and then the later pope is going to have more technology, and then the pope after that, way more technology. So it's crazy.
And now Pope Francis has an Instagram account, right?
Right, exactly. So in just the span of 100 years, there's this rapid change of the world and technology and how we're addressed by the Holy Father.
Yeah, he soon after the introduction, he gets into a critique of materialist economies. What is materialism? The simplest definition I could come up with off the top of my head is this focus on earthly temporal things, not the most grand things that are real, which can't be seen or measured, but on the things that can be seen or measured.
Yeah. If I could add, I would think it's those earthly temporal things for their own sake. It's kind of what it seemed like he was saying.
Or to fulfill the bodily passions and needs of humanity.
Right.
So he criticizes capitalism, socialism, and communism, and fascism.
Yeah.
So it makes probably the audience think, well, what else
What's
is
left?
there? Right? Which we've been answering that question for many weeks
time,
now.
yeah.
But he doesn't give the title of most of these things. He says there's errors and dangers in materialist socialism. He says there's fatal consequences in economic liberalism, which we would call, let's say, free market capitalism. Mm-hmm. And those things often lead to an unawareness of social duties. So focus on the state only, focus on the individual, collectivism versus radical individualism. So there's a critique there in the beginning of those two before he moves on to what you were talking about, the adjustments and the additions.
Yeah. For the material, I think I like that you mentioned he follows Pius XI's thread of individualism versus collectivism. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think he takes it a little, maybe not a step further, but the words he uses, I really appreciated. He kind of talked about the personal nature of material goods, or like the personal fulfillment of material goods. I guess one way I understood what he was saying was, and which is why I mentioned material goods for their own sake. He says that material goods aren't good for their own sake. They're not good in and of themselves, but because they contribute to the development of the person. And I really enjoyed that. And I think that's kind of maybe the philosophy behind the whole radio address, that, it's the personal development which is paramount.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. And I like the way you put it, too. Mm-hmm. It lends well to what I want to highlight here. Mm-hmm. And he has this section of the talk where he is affirming this idea of the universal destination of goods, that all people have a right to the goods of the earth, no matter where they are. And that's obviously a continuation of the previous encyclicals. Then, after that, he talks about the demands of private property, and he says that private property is secondary to the universal destination of goods. Mm. So these two principles are not new.
Right.
But the order in which he's presenting them is an adjustment. Mm-hmm. And I think everybody in the listening and viewing audience should take note of this. It seems to me, and remember the time that he's saying this, it seems that there is so much focus on the rights of individuals and private property that it may be infringing upon the universal destination of goods, and that there are large groups of people who do not have what they need to live. Mm. Does that sound right?
It does. I think it does. The problems Leo and Pius were addressing haven't changed all that much. Like, some developments have been made, but there are still those people that aren't receiving the benefit of the goods. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that that's a new thing that's happened, that, the destination of goods is not reaching those who aren't, like those people who are poor, those people who are in desperate situations. I think that was the same for Leo and for Pius. But I think Leo and Pius, like you said, emphasized this need for private property. Mm-hmm. So maybe people were heeding that, perhaps, is what you're saying. That, there was maybe an overcorrection.
I hear what you're saying, and I think there's some truth to that maybe, but I'm thinking about this in the context of nationalism. Mm. So universal destination of goods is a global principle. And what we see in World War II is that there are some nations that have nothing, and others that have very much, and there's just great disparity. Mm. So in nationalism, there's this focus on it's my nation first, and everybody else is kind of outside of my thinking. And he's saying, no, we need to think a little more globally. We need to care about people who we don't see every day.
Yeah. Okay.
And there's different levels of individual property and rights. There's the rights of the individual, but then there's the rights of the town and the rights of the state and the country. Mm. So it seems like maybe in his estimation, it's stopping at the level of country.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
And it needs to there needs to be a little more broader sharing of goods beyond that. Yeah. And that's just my take.
I think you're right. Staying on the nationalism, the wealth of nations, maybe even. We've mentioned before that I think it was Bonald that said that Adam Smith knows nothing about the wealth of nations. Mm-hmm. And I think Pope Pius XII reiterates that material goods and the abundance of them is not wealth. It's not richness, essentially. Mm-hmm. But we said that Bonald said it's like the morality, the virtue of the nation. And I like this quote that he has, Pius XII, about it, which it's brief, so I'll give it a read. So he's talking again about material goods and what they're meant to be for, the personal development. So he says, from this, beloved children, it will be easy for you to conclude that the economic riches of a people do not properly consist in the abundance of goods measured according to a purely and solely material calculation of their worth, but in the fact that such an abundance represents and offers really and effectively the material basis sufficient for the proper personal development of its members. So I think this kind of builds up something for the next point that I enjoyed. But again, he's saying what we've been saying, that it's not your GDP that is wealth. It's how the people of the nation are doing. And you highlight this nationalism. So it's not just the one nation. Let's not just focus on this one, but broaden this to the global sphere.
I'm glad you said that. It leads to something that I noticed that's later on in the radio address, because he talks about the field of public authority in connection to that. And he says there's this, the public authority has this responsibility to safeguard the rights of the human person. But at the same time, it does not have the right to interfere and decide upon individual activities. So it can't decide on the beginning and ending of human life. A state cannot do that. A state cannot determine the physical, spiritual, religious, and moral movements of individuals. So what do you think this is a critique of? Certainly fascism.
Yeah.
Fascism is all about taking the individuals of a nation and putting them and their work and their purpose to serve the goal of the nation, which is to battle against other nations in many cases. So it's connected to what you were saying before, and it's. I think he's saying something else. This is a very philosophical undermining of fascism.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And he can't say, remember, he's in Italy. He can't be too outspoken against it.
Yeah, that's true.
He has to be a little gentle in how he critiques it. And here he does it in a very effective way, in my opinion.
He has to be diplomatic.
Yeah, the state exists to serve the individual good of individuals and the common good. But fascism, it's employing individuals to serve the good of the state. It's the opposite.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's still like an adjustment, right? Like he's kind of making some fine tuning to things that came before.
And he's doing so over the radio to all people.
Yeah.
Which is hopefully getting through the ears of the Italians and the Spaniards and the Germans and hopefully entering into their hearts.
Yeah.
You know?
So what's next?
Well, I would like to get into what he talks about with private property.
Okay.
Am I skipping ahead?
No, I don't think so.
So this is interesting, and it leads to what he's about to talk about in regards to immigration. To me, this radio address is most strikingly new in his stances on immigration.
Yeah,
but before we get to that, he says that the rights of the family to vital space must be recognized. So here he is talking about the need for land. When he talks about private property, we've talked about different types of private property. The capital that's required to make goods.
Means of
production, right?
Yeah.
So we've been talking about the means of production. We've been talking about the land that you build your own house on and that you own. Here we get a special focus by the Pope on the need for the land in which people live.
Yeah, he uses, I think, pretty specific language about the land and vital space. So vital space, I think he means where there can be life, where you can live, like a vital space.
Yeah.
And then I think that's why he focuses on the vital. I think synonymous maybe is vital space and land. He's talking about land that is inhabitable, essentially. So then that's where private property comes in. The vital space is most important for a family, for someone that can inhabit that land, make it their own, and live through that land, on that land. And I think that follows to the point you mentioned about immigration, but you had a thought.
Yeah. I have two thoughts about this land thing. So how many people listening and watching this think that every family has a right to land? If I were in front of a classroom, I would have everybody raise their hands. How many people think that that's a right? Well, here's the Pope saying that that's what he thinks.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting. And it's not just land, but it's usable, beneficial land. So a couple of questions come to mind. How could such a thing come to be? What's the role of the government in that?
Yeah.
And I can't help but think about how a whole bunch of useless land was given to American natives in these, treaties. So I think that this is worth pondering, and it's worth looking ahead at how this could be done, and there will be future documents by the popes that help answer that question a little bit.
Yeah, I think he poses the question. I think he doesn't necessarily answer it himself, but I think in his words, I think he essentially says that private property is meant to conduce to the good of the family. And I think that the public authority has a role to contribute to that, not infringe on whether or not it happens for one family or another. I think he uses the word that the state should essentially preserve that function of private property, make it the means for a family to achieve the good or to attain the good. And essentially not even just to preserve it, but to perfect that function of private property. He's just kind of highlighting something without giving too much of an answer, except for when we start talking, like you said, about immigration. There, I think he's giving a little bit more.
He does give some concrete advice in regards to immigration and the right to land. I also think with this property thing and the land thing, he's just outright criticizing socialists and communists. And this is the Pope that made it, you're automatically excommunicated if you become a communist or if you support communists.
I didn't know that.
So, and he also had an encyclical that he wrote against the Nazi persecution of Jews, right? So he's very forceful, I think, and here in the radio address, he's undermining their philosophies, maybe in a more gentle way.
Yeah. Okay. Is it time to jump into the immigration question?
Yeah. Do you want to start?
Well, I think it's deeply connected to this land being vital space for families and connected to the nations. Some nations being less well off than others, much less well off. So he kind of just starts to introduce the idea that migrants, people that are emigrating or immigrating,
He uses both words.
Essentially are looking for land to inhabit, to live on, so that they can pursue the common good, the good of their family. And I think he just lays maybe some principles about immigration and immigration and how they can be beneficial to the people seeking this really important land. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I like your introduction. So first of all, he seems to think that immigration is inevitable. So since that's the case, how should it look?
Yeah.
And what he says is so foreign to me and to Americans that it's going to be hard to understand. But he thinks that the country from which somebody is emigrating should be in communication and in relationship with the country to whom the person is immigrating to. So that's, of course, now not how it happens today. And I think about Ellis Island. Think about the amount of Sicilians getting on a boat and just showing up at Ellis Island unannounced in the hundreds or the thousands, right? I don't know if that's really how it worked, but I know that basically it was not a relationship between the two countries. And what the Pope is asking for and calling for is for both countries to benefit from that relationship of immigration.
Yeah.
Maybe one country that has too many people has less. Maybe the other country that is receiving the person also gets something out of it. Maybe they need more people, or maybe there's even money exchanged, or there's some sort of communication and relationship between the two.
Yeah.
So that is such an interesting, wonderful idea.
Yeah, I agree. And it's like the other principles laid out by the previous popes. He doesn't give very specific advice, but he does say there should be relationship, and if it's done properly, he gives maybe more advice than this, but if it's done properly, it, I think, should be beneficial. I think he's saying that if it's done well, that is the inevitable result, that both parties would gain, the country that people are immigrating to and immigrating from. And that's, like you said, it's new. It's kind of the first time this is really spoken about very directly.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's developed yet. I haven't gotten far into the later documents, but it does come out very clearly here that it's like a relevant piece.
One thing I could say for sure is that Congress has been working for months on a new immigration bill, which looks like it won't be passed. And nowhere does that bill as far as I know, talk about relationship with the countries from which the immigrants are coming. So I think that this would be a wonderful goal. It might be difficult to achieve, but it would be a wonderful goal. Another thing Pope Pius XII mentions here is that immigrants who come should be given land. All right, so
vital space.
Vital space. So think about, all right, you're an immigrant, you're in a new country. Where do you start? How do you start? Well, this would be quite a start, would it not? And how could systems be built to bring in immigrants in a civilized, dignified way, and to make sure that they're put in a place where they could start well? I mean, this is such a foreign thing that he's saying.
Yeah, I think it's very foreign because the worldview that Pius XII operates under is very different from the worldview many Americans or people today hold. Like you said, there's this nationalism where you see the other country as foreign and you don't care.
Us versus them.
Yeah, right. Yeah. You don't care much about them. But Pius doesn't. He's like, we're all God's people. The distribution of good is for everyone, not just one individual nation. So this makes perfect sense if you're thinking about it in that context. But when you're thinking about nationalism or your national identity versus the other, this makes no sense. Like, why would I give this to this foreigner? Why would we as a nation give this to others? So I think that's part of warming up to this.
Yeah. Pope Pius XII thinks from the perspective of global solidarity, from the way that he reshaped the College of Cardinals to what he's calling for in immigration. It's the same philosophy and worldview in different subjects.
Yes, I wish he had an encyclical so we can dive more into his thought, because it seems like he was a brilliant guy, even though he was, a diplomat. It sounds like he made some progress for the church and for the world. So I wish we had more time and more of Pius's stuff to dive into, like you said earlier, but we don't, because he probably had his hands tied up with a lot of stuff. So yeah, that's Pope Pius XII's radio address to social structure. You can find it if you speak or read Italian, Portuguese, or Spanish on the Vatican website. If not, you can look it up. It's transcribed by different organizations. So you can probably just look up Pope Pius XII's radio address if you wanted to read it for yourself. But it's another document or address commemorating Rerum Novarum. We're going to get to more. But I think that does it for episode 3. Thank you, Brian. Thanks, Joe,
Freddy.
for production,
Thanks,
as
Joe.
always. And thank you all for listening to the Paul Street Journal. See you next time.